Although the general processing of new arrivals at Treblinka was completely overhauled during the first days of Stangel's reign as commandant, the selection process was initially kept the same. Consequently, Ebel's tactic of selecting around 50 to 100 male prisoners from each transport, working them for a few days, and then killing them, was still upheld. With such a system, the SS would never fall short on slave labour, as a group of workers could easily be replaced with fresh recruits from a new transport. More importantly, however, was the fact that killing these men, a mere few days after they had arrived, ensured that no organised resistance movements could begin to form, as the men would not have enough time to plan any resistance. Furthermore, in such a short space of time, it would also be unlikely that the men would be able to properly trust one another, as they had only just met, effectively nullifying any growth of resistance. Ebel's system, which on first inspection sounds fairly watertight, was later abandoned by Stangl and Wirth, following an incident involving a lone resistor. You see, during Ebel's reign as commandant of Treblinka, and during the early period of Stangel's, the SS were less than thorough in their searching of new arrivals. Hence, it was only a matter of time before one of these men recently imported from the Warsaw ghetto would manage to hide some kind of weapon on their person and enter the camp with it concealed. One such man went by the name of Meir Berliner. Berliner, who was an Argentinian Jew, had been deported from Warsaw to Treblinka at some point in early September. Upon his arrival into the camp, he was spared from death, being assigned to work in a heavy labour unit. Tragically for Berliner, his wife and young daughter, who had arrived with him, were immediately sent to the so-called shower block, and were consequently murdered in Treblinka's gas chambers. Berliner, who had smuggled a knife out of the Warsaw ghetto, managed to enter Treblinka with the weapon concealed in his clothing. A short while after he had arrived into the camp, on the eve of September the 11th, 1942, a couple of weeks into Stangel's reign, Berliner found himself at an evening roll call. Addressing the roll call was Oberscharführer Max Biala, a 37-year-old middle management sort of type who was likely about to authorise a mass execution. Biala announced to Berliner and his cohort that they must split into two separate groups, with one group containing those who had arrived that day, and the other comprising of the men who had been at Treblinka for longer. These men, unsure of whether the SS were going to shoot the new recruits or the old guard, understandably hesitated. Sensing unease, the SS and Travnikis began to threaten them, and started beating those who refused to move. At this point, Berliner had clearly had enough. He likely rationalised, or just outright knew, that his wife and child had been murdered, and sought retribution. Indeed, Berliner probably reasoned that it would be far better to avenge his family and brethren by fighting back, rather than meekly resigning himself to death. Therefore, during the ensuing stampede, Berliner took his chance. Unsheathing a knife from his clothing, Berliner lunged at Max Biala. Biala, who was stunned by the attack, was stabbed multiple times in the chest, and collapsed as a result. For a few seconds, everyone stood still, until the Travnikis had actually realised what had happened. In a flapping panic, they opened fire into the crowd, causing the prisoners to scatter in terror. Berliner, who was absolutely defiant in his resolve, stood still and embraced death. He was shot and killed mere seconds after he had attacked Biala. Minutes later, SS Untersturmführer Kurt Franz arrived on the scene and had Biala evacuated out of the camp and driven to a nearby hospital. Unfortunately for Biala, Berliner's stab wounds were fatal, and the Oberscharführer perished en route to the hospital. Franz, who needed no encouragement when it came to executing inmates, immediately had 10 of Berliner's cohort shot. Later that evening, SS Sturmbannführer Christian Wirth, who was still in Treblinka at this point, was called onto the scene. Wirth, who was furious that a fellow SS man had perished at the hands of an inmate, decided that Franz's execution of 10 men was simply not enough, and the following morning, ordered the execution of a further 150 men. For the Jews of Treblinka, the message was now clear. While Berliner's act of heroism was indeed brave, it was largely futile. In exchange for the life of one SS man, 160 Jews had perished, a trade not worthy of anyone, even those in a death camp. If resistance was to be effective in the future, it would have to be organised by a collective, as any individual's act of bravery, no matter how gallant, simply wouldn't be worth the cost. However, Berliner's last stand wasn't entirely in vain, and in fact, actually sowed the seeds of what would be Treblinka's downfall. While the SS were furious at Bialas's death, they were also very shaken by it. Stangl and Wirth, who wisely rationalised that people with nothing to lose are highly dangerous, took drastic precautionary measures to ensure that it wouldn't happen again. Therefore, they abandoned Ebel's rolling cycle of Jewish forced labourers in favour of a permanent workforce of Jews. From Bialas's death onwards, inmates in Treblinka would only be executed if they had outlived their usefulness, as it were, rather than being periodically shot in favour of fresh arrivals. By doing so, the Jews would be further deterred from fighting back, as they would know that, for as long as they were useful, they would stay alive. However, it was a double-edged sword, and ultimately marked the beginning of the end for Stangl and Treblinka. You see, by allowing a permanent workforce, Stangl and Wirth enabled the Jews to properly befriend one another, and by extension, eventually form underground resistance movements. Without this ability to converse with one another over extended periods of time, or the simple prerequisite of trusting people that you've known for a while, Treblinka's revolt planning could never have taken place. So, Berliner's last stand was not entirely in vain, and his heroic sacrifice ultimately sowed the seeds of destruction for the Treblinka SS that were to be finally harvested on August 2nd, 1943.